Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria, and one of my viewers, SamBus90, who asked me another question recently as well, which I've addressed, also asked a very good question, so I'm going to address that one also. You're getting spoilt today, Sam. And the question is, where did medieval soldiers get their swords from? Well, obviously that doesn't mean, where geographically did they get their swords from. Lots of swords were made in the Rhineland, for example. Swords were made in Toledo and all over the place, but that's not the question. The question is, where did a normal medieval soldier expect to procure their sword? How did they get it? Were they given it? Did they buy it? Well, to answer this question, we first of all have to ask who, where and when, okay? And clearly the answer is going to vary depending on those factors. So for example, if you're talking about a person in Ireland or northern Britain in the Viking era, well, how one of those people would get a sword is, generally speaking, by being of the social class where they could afford to procure, buy or have made for them a sword, or win it in battle. Okay, so this is the Albion Clontarf, and this is a sword that was found in Ireland, but probably originates from Francia, from France. And how did it get from France to Ireland? Well, we don't know. Who did it belong to? We don't know. There are many, many unknowns, but we can make some assumptions. The sort of person in the 9th century that would have owned a sword like this was probably a fairly wealthy, landowning, kind of high status individual, the sort of person who probably would have also been able to afford a mail shirt and a helmet and a few horses, and went hunting and had a household consisting of probably a dozen or more people, possibly even hundreds of people in terms of farming his land. So probably someone who was wealthy, influential and important in his time. How did he end up with a sword in Ireland that came from what's now France? Well, that is, we have no way of knowing, okay, but we can make a few average statements, we can make a few general statements about how that might happen. Number one, it could happen through trade. So it could be that, for example, traders, merchants came around selling swords to wealthy individuals. They travelled around with a bunch of swords, selling them to whoever could afford them. Okay, so that's one way. Another way could be that the person from Ireland travelled to France and bought a sword when they were there. So many people went on pilgrimage. King Alfred the Great in this very period went to Rome as a boy or teenager perhaps, so it could be a wealthy person from Ireland could have gone on pilgrimage, or could have had some sort of alliance, could have had a marriage alliance. There could have been, this Irish person may have had a Frankish wife, or may have married one of their children to a Frankish nobleman, and they may have been an exchange of gifts. Or we could bring Vikings into it, perhaps raiding Vikings, raided somewhere in Francia, perhaps what's now Normandy, destroyed some settlement, killed a few people, took this in prize, and then when they were trading slaves perhaps in Ireland, they exchanged some Irish slaves, because the Irish also traded, and everybody traded in slaves at the time. Maybe the Irish sold some slaves and this person got a sword in return by bartering. There are all sorts of mechanisms for how that person could have got that kind of sword. But that's actually an easier question, or a simpler question to answer when we're talking about high status individuals, because generally speaking the answer for a high status person, whether it's in the 9th century or whether it's in the 16th century, is going to be they bought it, or they were given it sometimes. So generally speaking, high status individuals have no problem getting pretty much whatever they want in this period. If they've got the money or the power or the influence, they're going to get nice things. Okay, they're going to end up with nice horses, nice weapons, nice houses, castles, whatever. Okay, so that is a simple question to answer. But a little bit more complicated is if we go into the period when swords were more common and swords were carried by more soldiers. So if we fast forward to, let's say, the 12th century. So this is not a 12th century sword, this is a 15th century style of sword, but it's slightly more appropriate than the Viking era sword. So let's say 12th, 13th century. So in the 12th or 13th century, what we find is large numbers of soldiery who are essentially raised through sort of feudalism, a late form of feudalism, and they have to give military service. Part of their duty, and we're not talking about knights here, we're talking about people who most of the time would be farming the land, or in some cases living in towns and cities, and they have to give military service. They've got no choice. They're essentially subject to the draft, like in Vietnam. They're told, right, it's your turn to give military service for the next 4 months. You're going to be on campaign. You might be going on crusade to the Holy Land. You might be patrolling the border of our lands in France to prevent against French incursions. You might be going, you know, whatever. You might be with our alliance. We're going to go and fight in Sicily or whatever. So, or you might just be doing military service. In other words, maintaining military structures and patrolling and perhaps tax gathering and things like this within your own area or your own country, some other bit of the country maybe. You might be going to fight the Scots or the Irish or the Welsh or some rebellious bunch of people in Kent or whatever, okay? So you're essentially press ganged. You're not press ganged as such, but you're drafted. You're told, right, it's either prison or military service, and you've got to go and do your military service. And for many people, they may have felt that that was part of their obligation to society and God and everything else. I think a lot of people at that time probably felt their place in society and understood that, you know, the fact that they were allowed to farm a bit of land, that came with certain obligations. And one of those obligations is when your Lord told you it's time for military service, that's what you had to do. So where did they get their weapons from? Well, if we go back into the Viking era, generally speaking, these people would have been what was known as the Fyrd, or the Great Fyrd, and one man from every 5 hides, as it was. They were expected to come with a certain amount of military equipment. And that usually, at least in Britain, and I think Frankish Gaul as well, generally consisted of a shield and a spear and some kind of appropriate clothing. But in terms of weapons, it was a shield and a spear, because that was what most people had. So the answer to the question in regards to the earlier medieval period is that every man was expected either to have a sword, a shield, a spear and a shield of their own, or they were expected to be provided it by the local community. So, for example, I mentioned the 5 hide system, Burgle hide. So, if one man of every 5 hides, a hide is an area of land, if I remember correctly, that can provide for one family. So, within each community of every 5 people, they have to provide one for military service. That as a community, they can go, oh, well, you know, I've got Grandad's spear, it's still in good order, I look after it. And someone else will go, yeah, I've got a shield that I've repaired recently. Here you go, here's your spear and your shield. And off they go to campaign against the marauding Vikings or whatever, okay? The Mercians. So spear and shield, pretty omnipresent in what some people call the Dark Ages or the early medieval period. But when we get into the slightly later period, swords, we know swords were more common, much more common, even by the 11th century. By the time of Hastings, swords seem to have been much more common. And by the 12th and 13th century, very common. In fact, so much so that we even know that fencing schools were being established as late as the late 1100s. So around the time of the Third Crusade, we actually have references to people teaching fencing. Okay, and we know that in the 13th century, common people in towns and cities were sometimes walking around wearing swords and bucklers and getting into fights and this kind of stuff. So swords weren't hugely expensive by that point. Common people did own them. And so I think the answer has to be that when those people in the 12th and 13th century were called on military service, called up for military service, by and large, their sword was their personal sidearm. So that wouldn't be that they were necessarily expected to provide all of their equipment, but we know if we fast forward to the 14th century, by the time of the 100 Years' War, we know that in the 100 Years' War, by the time of the Battle of Crécy, for example, in 1346, we know that someone who was going to be indentured to give military service, or someone who was going to had to give essentially feudal service for a militia, had to come with a certain amount of equipment. Now the equipment listed is usually, and bearing in mind most of these people are archers, the equipment listed is usually a bow, some arrows, a sword, pretty much always listed, a jack, in other words padded armour of some sort, like a gambeson essentially, and very often is also mentioned a dagger, a helmet, and sometimes a buckler. So by the 14th century, it seems to have been absolutely assumed that anybody wanting to give military service, and bear in mind this was indentured military service in most cases, so to a degree you can't really call them professionals because it wasn't a full-time job, but they were being paid for their services. They were expected to provide their own equipment, with one main exception, and that was munitions. Okay. So there is a reason that in Britain, anyway, the symbol for the War Department, or what became the Ministry of Defence, is the broad arrow. And it's because originally the War Department's main job was to provide arrows or ammunition, later on of course musket balls and gunpowder, for the armed forces. But in the 14th century, these archers and billmen and the various other types of soldiers who were indenturing for military service were expected to provide their own equipment, regardless of what social rank they were. But we do know that there were some exceptions to that. So one exception, I mentioned militias. So in some cases, local militias seems to have been run quite similarly to 18th and 19th century yeomanry and militia, whereby sometimes it was a local landowner would provide some equipment for the militia. But you've got to remember, to some degree, these are different people, because the people who are indenturing to give military service are essentially going, look, I want to fight, I want to get paid, I've got the equipment, I'm ready to do it, I can pull a powerful enough bow, I can shoot enough arrows, pay me and I'll come on campaign to France or wherever, or Spain, and I will fight for you, and look, I'm ready to do it. So that's one group of people. The other group of people are people who are told by their landlord, okay, it's time for you to come and repair some castle wall and ditches and do some patrolling and guard the coast, because we've heard that the French are going to be raiding and this kind of stuff. So and they are essentially forced into service, and so therefore they probably are given some degree of stuff because they can't fully be expected to come equipped, because they're not really volunteers. So in answer to, certainly by the sort of the late medieval period, the 14th and 15th centuries, the answer is if someone is a voluntary soldier, usually they provide their own equipment, with the exception of arrows and gunpowder and cannonballs and stuff like that, munitions. But if they are forced into obliged feudal type military service, then very often they're provided with stuff. So very often town militias and this kind of stuff are provided with stuff either by the town, the city, or one wealthy individual who happens to be organising this whole thing. And that's one of the reasons why, if we go to parts of Germany, for example, I've been in Bavaria and Austria, where you can still find local arsenals within a town, armories, where they maintained swords and armours and polearms and guns and crossbows and things like this for the defence of the town. And that's a very, very different thing, because of course that is, if you treat a town as an isolated entity, and bear in mind that within Germany and Italy a lot of towns and cities were almost self-sufficient. Obviously they traded, but they were responsible for their own defence. They couldn't necessarily expect the king or the emperor or whoever, the local viscount, to come and protect them. They had to protect themselves. And so one of the things they did with their taxes was they invested in defence, a bit like a miniature country. And that's why we have this term city-states, usually applied to Italy, whereby the city or the town, they look after themselves. They have their own militia, and if they've got enough money from taxes, from trade, and taxes using toll roads and all this kind of stuff, and local taxes on produce, then they invest in their defences, which can be their fortifications, their walls, their gates, their towers, but and their bridges. And in addition, they invest in arms and armour to provide the allocated townspeople for the manual defence of the town themselves. So I hope that goes some way towards answering the question. We also know there were a few other exceptions on military campaigns. I've never looked into this record myself, but my understanding is that on the Agincourt campaign, for a start, a lot of the French soldiers on the Agincourt campaign were not indentured soldiers, they were militia. So that's one of the reasons when we talk about Agincourt, in fact, when we talk about the 100 Years' War as a whole, very often when you're talking about X number of English against X number of French, remember that there were French on both sides, but anyway, when you're talking about English army and French army, very often a proportion of the French army would consist of militias. In other words, hastily raised, press-ganged, forced into service, not volunteering soldiers, whereas the English army was by nature an indentured force, as close as you could get almost in that period to professional soldiers. They were being paid, they were equipping themselves, and they were specifically there to do that job and to loot and get, to get a share of the loot out of it as well. So very different opponents in that sense. But my understanding is that during the Agincourt campaign, one of the French commanders did invest a lot of money in pavises, which weren't subsequently used. Obviously the battle may have gone differently if they'd used a lot of pavises against English archery, but that does indicate that to some degree arms and equipment were being provided by some of the magnates, some of the ruling aristocracy for the soldiery. But I think again that comes back to my point that a lot of the French soldiers were militia. They weren't indentured professional soldiers. Knights, of course, were. Knights were essentially, knights and men-at-arms were usually indentured, and well, they were indentured by virtue of the fact that they were knights. Their whole social purpose, their whole social class was invented and created and sustained by the fact that they fought. For conquest or for defence. That was what they were there to do, and they were paid pretty well for it. But the majority of the soldiers, of course, weren't knights, weren't men-at-arms. Right, I hope that partly covers or largely covers the question. I may have missed some aspects. If you think there's bits that I haven't really covered or haven't explained very well, feel free to comment underneath. I don't mind some healthy criticism. But I think by and large, a medieval soldier, if their job was to be a soldier, if they had chosen to be a soldier, very often bought their own equipment, provided their own equipment. If it was someone who was forced into being a soldier by just, it's your job to come and do this now, it's the draft basically, then sometimes, and very often in fact, I think they were provided with stuff. But also just to reiterate that throughout the medieval period, from the sort of Viking era right the way through to the end of the Middle Ages in the 15th, 16th century, we see a very, very big difference in what people could afford, partly because those objects became relatively cheaper and partly because there were more, I suppose, people with expendable wealth, essentially the rise of the middle classes. So by the 14th and 15th century, we have a lot of people who are occupying the middle strata of social spectrum, whereas at the beginning of that you basically got some rich people and some poor people and not very much in the middle. But by and large swords got cheaper, and that was for many, many reasons, but largely because it became easier to produce steel of good enough quality in great enough quantity that you could make lots of swords and sell them affordably. So by the 14th century it seems that basically anyone pretty much who might want a sword could afford a sword without any great trouble. I hope that's been somewhat interesting, and I'll see you for the next video. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!